The steam rose endlessly from the sacred spring, day and night, winter and summer, year after year. For centuries the waters had emerged from the depths of the earth beneath the city of Aquae Sulis, carrying warmth from unseen places far below Roman Britain. The local Britons believed the spring belonged to a goddess. The Romans agreed. They simply gave her another name, Sulis Minerva. And around her waters they had built one of the most remarkable temples in the empire. On cold autumn mornings, visitors arriving from the surrounding hills often saw the entire complex shrouded in mist. Columns emerged from the vapor like ghosts. Bronze statues glimmered in torchlight. Priests moved silently through clouds of steam. It was a place unlike any other in Britannia. Part temple, part bathhouse, part mystery. The city itself lay nestled among green hills in the province's southwest. Merchants arrived daily from Londinium, Isca Dumnoniorum, and distant ports along the coast. Retired soldiers settled there. Wealthy landowners visited to ease aching joints. Pilgrims travelled hundreds of miles seeking healing from the sacred waters. And everywhere, beneath every conversation, lingered the presence of the goddess. The spring bubbled, the steam rose, the water watched. On the morning our story begins, the city was waking beneath a blanket of fog. The streets glistened from overnight rain. Market stalls were being erected. Bakers lit ovens. Mule carts rattled across cobbled roads. The ordinary business of Roman life continued, until a scream shattered the dawn. It came from the baths. Several labourers immediately dropped their tools. Nearby priests rushed toward the sacred enclosure. A pair of soldiers stationed near the temple entrance followed moments later. The scream had come from one of the attendants, a young man named Lucius, and when the others reached him, they discovered he was standing beside the great bath, trembling uncontrollably. He pointed toward the water, unable to speak, unable even to move. The steam drifted around him. The sacred pool lay still. At first nobody understood. Then one of the priests saw it, a body, floating among the reflections, face upward, eyes open. The corpse drifted slowly through the steaming water, watching the sky, watching nothing. The priests immediately ordered the area cleared. Visitors were removed, temple attendants dismissed, the sacred precinct sealed. Yet word spread through Aquae Sulis within an hour. Word always spread, particularly when murder was involved. And this death would prove far more troubling than most, because the dead man was no ordinary citizen. His name was Gaius Marcellus Varro, merchant, investor, landowner, one of the wealthiest men in Western Britannia. His warehouses lined the river at Londinium. His ships traded with Gaul. His estate stretched across several provinces. Most importantly, he was powerful. Powerful men were not supposed to die mysteriously, particularly inside sacred temples. By mid-morning, the local magistrates had arrived. So had several military officers. And standing among them was a man named Quintus Valerius Severus, the governor's investigator, a former army tribune, 42 years old, tall, lean, grey beginning to appear at his temples. A man who had spent most of his life uncovering uncomfortable truths. Quintus stood beside the great bath and studied the body carefully. The victim had already been removed from the water. Now he lay beneath a linen sheet beside the pool. The investigator crouched, examining, observing, thinking. There were no obvious wounds, no stab marks, no cuts, no bruising. No signs of violence whatsoever, which made the expression upon the dead man's face all the more disturbing. Fear, pure fear. Even in death it remained visible. His eyes stared upward, wide, frozen, as though the merchant had witnessed something terrible during his final moments, something impossible. The chief priest approached quietly. "What do you think?" Quintus remained silent for several seconds. Then, "I think he was frightened." The priest nodded. "Everyone has noticed that." The investigator stood. Steam drifted around them. Temple bells sounded somewhere beyond the courtyard. What was he doing here? The priest frowned. Praying. At dawn. Yes. The answer seemed genuine. Pilgrims frequently visited the spring early in the morning. The sacred waters possessed particular significance at sunrise. The investigator looked toward the pool. What was he praying for? The priest hesitated. An interesting hesitation. Quintus noticed immediately. "You know." The priest sighed. "Perhaps." The investigator waited. Eventually the older man spoke. He believed the goddess was angry. That was unexpected. Quintus folded his arms. "Why?" The priest glanced toward the steaming waters, as though wary of being overheard. Several months ago, a valuable offering disappeared. The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Stolen. No one knows." The priest lowered his voice. "A gold figure." Quintus frowned. "Of Sulis Minerva." The priest nodded. The investigator said nothing. The timing felt significant, very significant. The priest continued. Marcellus had recently become obsessed with the theft. Obsessed how? He questioned people. The older man looked uncomfortable. He made accusations. What sort of accusations? The priest hesitated. Then, he believed someone inside the temple was responsible. The investigator looked around the sacred precinct. Columns rose from drifting steam. Priests moved silently through the mist. Visitors waited beyond closed gates. The atmosphere suddenly felt different. Less peaceful, more dangerous. A wealthy merchant. A missing sacred offering. A temple full of suspects. The beginnings of a very interesting murder. A temple attendant approached hurriedly. "Sir." Quintus turned. "What is it?" The young man looked nervous. Very nervous. "We found something." The investigator followed immediately. The attendant led him through a series of courtyards and chambers, past shrines, past altars, past offerings dedicated to the goddess. Eventually, they reached the sacred spring itself, the source of the waters, the place where countless pilgrims cast coins and curse tablets into the depths. The attendant pointed downward. There! Something glinted beneath the water. Quintus crouched. A bronze hook was used to retrieve it. Moments later, the object rested in his hands. A curse tablet, thin lead, covered in writing. The investigator frowned. Curse tablets were common at Aquae Sulis. People routinely asked the goddess to punish thieves, rivals, and enemies. Thousands had been cast into the spring over the years. Yet this one looked new, very new. The writing remained clear, fresh, recently inscribed. Quintus began reading. As he did, the expression upon his face changed. The attendant noticed. "So?" The investigator remained silent. The words etched into the lead were simple, yet deeply unsettling, especially under the circumstances. for the tablet appeared to name the dead man directly, and the final line read, "Let Sulis Minerva take from him all health, all sleep, and all life until the debt is repaid." The steam drifted across the sacred spring. The water bubbled quietly. And for the first time that morning, Quintus Valerius Severus found himself wondering whether he was investigating a murder or a curse. Far above the temple roofs, dark clouds gathered once more over the hills of Britannia. And beneath the waters of the goddess, unseen by anyone, something moved. Or perhaps it was only the steam. Either way, the mystery of Aquae Sulis had begun. Chapter 2. The Temple of Whispers. The rain returned shortly after noon. A fine drizzle at first, barely noticeable. Then a steady grey curtain drifting across the hills surrounding Aquae Sulis. From the upper terraces of the temple complex, Quintus Valerius Severus watched the weather settle over the city. The sacred spring continued to steam beneath him, untroubled by the cold, untroubled by the rain. The waters of Sulis Minerva had flowed here long before Rome arrived, long before roads, long before cities, long before history itself. The local Britons had worshipped the spring for generations beyond counting. The Romans had merely built walls around something ancient, something older than the empire, perhaps older than memory. Quintus found the thought unsettling. The investigator preferred facts, witnesses, evidence, motives, the sort of things that could be written neatly into reports. Unfortunately, the baths of Aquae Sulis seemed determined to provide none of those things. The curse tablet lay upon a nearby table. Its words remained clear, simple, threatening. The name of the dead merchant appeared twice. The final curse once more lingered in Quintus's thoughts. Let Sulis Minerva take from him all health, all sleep, and all life until the debt is repaid. The investigator sighed, then turned toward the temple offices. It was time to begin asking questions. The first witness proved disappointingly ordinary, a temple attendant named Lucius, the same young man who had discovered the body. The poor fellow remained visibly shaken. His hands trembled throughout the interview. His eyes rarely left the floor. Quintus sat opposite him within a small chamber overlooking the sacred precinct. Rain tapped gently against the window. "When did you arrive?" "Before sunrise." "Why?" "I always arrive before sunrise." The answer sounded genuine. The investigator nodded. "What happened next?" The young attendant swallowed, then spoke carefully. "I began preparing the eastern changing rooms." A pause. The usual duties. Quintus waited. Eventually, Lucius continued. "When I passed the great bath, I saw something floating." His face became pale. The memory clearly remained fresh. "At first I thought it was cloth." The investigator nodded. "But it wasn't." "No." The attendant stared at the floor. It was him. Silence followed. "What happened then?" "I screamed." A perfectly reasonable response. The interview ended shortly afterward. Lucius possessed no enemies, no motive, no useful information, only fear. The second witness proved considerably more interesting. His name was Aelius Cassian, senior priest, keeper of temple records, a man who had served Sulis Minerva for nearly 20 years. Unlike Lucius, he appeared calm, too calm perhaps. Quintus studied him carefully. The priest sat perfectly still throughout the questioning, hands folded, expression composed, eyes thoughtful, the sort of man who measured every word. "Tell me about the missing offering." The priest sighed. "I was wondering when we would discuss that." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because everyone eventually does." Rain drummed softly overhead. The priest continued. "The figure disappeared 6 months ago." "What figure?" "A golden statue." The older man paused. "Small. Perhaps the size of your hand." Quintus nodded. "And valuable." The priest laughed softly. "Very." A sensible answer. The investigator leaned forward. "Who knew it was missing?" The priest hesitated. Another hesitation. "Interesting." "Very few." "Why?" The priest looked uncomfortable. "Because we hoped to recover it quietly." Now things became more interesting. The investigator folded his arms. "You feared embarrassment." The priest nodded. "Among other things." Quintus remained silent, allowing the older man to continue. "People come here because they believe the goddess protects the spring." The priest glanced toward the sacred waters. What would they think if sacred offerings could be stolen from beneath her very eyes? The investigator understood immediately. Faith, reputation, pilgrims, money. The theft threatened all of them. "Who knew?" The priest sighed. "Myself, the chief priest, several attendants." Another pause, and Marcellus. The investigator nodded slowly. There it was again. The dead merchant, always appearing at the center of events. Why him? The priest looked away. He funded part of the temple restoration. A wealthy benefactor. That explained much. The merchant would have enjoyed access others lacked. Perhaps too much access. Quintus made a note, then asked the obvious question. Did anyone suspect him? The room became very quiet. The priest stared at the rain-covered window. Outside, temple bells sounded faintly through the weather. Eventually, he answered. Some did. Interesting. Very interesting. Why? The priest looked almost reluctant. Because he became obsessed. The investigator had heard that word before. Obsessed. He disliked repeated words. Repeated words usually concealed important truths. Explain. The priest exhaled slowly. At first he wanted to help. Then he began making accusations. The older man shook his head, questioning servants, questioning priests, questioning visitors. The investigator frowned, as though conducting his own investigation. The priest nodded. Exactly. The room fell silent. Quintus considered the implications. A wealthy merchant investigating a sacred theft, accusing temple staff, making enemies, then dying mysteriously. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves. Unfortunately, they still formed no recognizable picture. The interview ended shortly afterward. The priest returned to his duties. The investigator remained alone. For a while, he watched the rain. The city beyond the temple walls appeared blurred and indistinct, a world of wet rooftops and drifting mist. Then a knock sounded at the door. A soldier entered, young, breathless, concerned. Sir. Quintus immediately recognized the expression. Something had happened. What is it? The soldier hesitated. We found another tablet. The investigator stood immediately. Where? The spring. A few minutes later he stood once more beside the sacred waters. Steam drifted upward. Rain hissed softly where it touched the pool. The second tablet rested upon a cloth. Recently recovered, recently written. Quintus examined it carefully. The handwriting differed from the first, yet the message proved equally unsettling, perhaps more so. The inscription read, "The thief walks among the servants of the goddess." The investigator frowned. The words continued. "He hides beneath sacred roofs. He fears the water. He fears what waits beneath." The final line had been scratched deeply into the lead, almost violently. The goddess already knows his name. Quintus stared at the tablet. The rain continued falling. The steam continued rising. The spring continued bubbling. Something about the message bothered him. Not the accusation, not the threat, the certainty. The writer sounded convinced, absolutely convinced, as though they possessed knowledge no one else did. The investigator looked toward the dark waters. Pilgrims had thrown thousands of tablets into this spring over the centuries. Requests, prayers, curses, appeals for justice. Yet somehow these felt different, more urgent, more personal, as though someone desperately wanted the truth discovered. A shadow moved through the steam. Quintus looked up sharply. Nothing. Only mist drifting across the water. Yet for the briefest moment, he thought he had seen a figure standing on the opposite side of the spring. A woman, perhaps. White robes, long hair, watching, then gone. The investigator frowned. He disliked mysteries. He disliked ghosts even more. And as the afternoon faded into evening, the baths of Aquae Sulis seemed increasingly determined to provide both. For somewhere within the temple complex walked a killer. Of that much Quintus was certain. The question was whether the goddess intended to reveal them, or punish them first. Chapter 3. The Woman in the Steam. The baths closed at sunset. One by one the final visitors departed. Pilgrims wrapped themselves in cloaks against the rain. Merchants returned to inns and taverns. Priests extinguished lanterns throughout the outer courtyards. Soon only the temple staff remained, and Quintus Valerius Severus. The investigator had no intention of leaving. Not tonight. 2 cursed tablets, 1 dead merchant, a stolen sacred offering, and now rumours of strange sightings among the steam. Too many questions remained unanswered. The rain continued long after darkness fell. Water dripped from tiled roofs. Gutters overflowed. The streets beyond the temple walls grew quiet. Yet the baths themselves remained alive. The sacred spring never slept. Steam continued rising into the night. The waters continued bubbling from unseen depths. And beneath the torchlight, the entire complex appeared transformed, more mysterious, more ancient, more dangerous. Quintus stood alone beside the great bath. The vast pool reflected flickering lantern light. Columns rose from drifting vapor. Shadows stretched across marble floors. The place felt less like a Roman temple and more like something much older, something waiting patiently beneath civilization. The investigator disliked the sensation. He preferred certainty. The baths offered none. Footsteps echoed behind him. He turned. Aelius Cassian approached. The senior priest carried a lantern. Its warm glow illuminated the mist around him. "You should rest." Quintus smiled faintly. "I suspect the same advice applies to you." The priest nodded. "Probably." The 2 men stood overlooking the sacred waters. Neither spoke for several moments. The atmosphere encouraged silence. Eventually, the investigator broke it. Tell me about Sulis. The priest raised an eyebrow. The goddess? Yes. The older man smiled. That is a very large question. Quintus folded his arms. I have time. The priest looked toward the spring. The Britons worshipped her long before Rome arrived. His voice became almost reverential. To them she was the spirit of these waters, the keeper of the spring, the guardian of healing. Steam drifted across the pool. The priest continued. When the Romans arrived, we recognized similarities with Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, of justice, of craft, so the two became one. The investigator nodded. A common Roman practice. Merge local gods with familiar ones, create harmony, create stability, create empire. The priest smiled, yet many still believe Sulis remains something older. The words lingered. Older. The investigator looked toward the dark waters. What does that mean? The priest hesitated. Then, it means some people think the goddess listens. A gust of wind swept through the courtyard. Lantern flames flickered. The steam shifted. The priest lowered his voice and occasionally answers. The investigator almost laughed. Almost. Yet something prevented him. Perhaps the setting. Perhaps the murder. Perhaps the curse tablets. Whatever the reason, the words did not seem entirely ridiculous. Not here, not tonight. A distant bell sounded somewhere within the complex. The priest frowned. Strange. What is? The bell. The older man looked around. There shouldn't be anyone in the eastern chambers. The investigator immediately became alert. Neither man spoke. The bells sounded again. A single chime. Soft. Distant. Almost lost beneath the rain. The priest raised his lantern. Come. They crossed the courtyard quickly. The eastern chambers occupied one of the oldest sections of the baths. Roman additions had expanded the complex over generations, yet portions of the original structures remained. Dark corridors, ancient stonework, forgotten rooms, places few visitors ever saw. The sound had come from there. Their footsteps echoed through empty halls. Steam drifted through archways. Water trickled somewhere beyond sight. The atmosphere grew increasingly strange, almost dreamlike. The bells sounded once more, closer now, then stopped. The silence that followed felt unnatural. The priest and investigator exchanged glances. Neither particularly liked what they were feeling. Eventually, they reached the eastern sanctuary, a small chamber overlooking a part of the sacred spring. The room was empty, completely empty. No priests, no attendants, no visitors, nothing. The bell sat motionless beside the altar. The priest approached cautiously, examining it, then frowned. What is it? The older man looked confused. The rope is wet. The investigator stared. Rainwater. Impossible. The sanctuary stood well within the complex. No weather could reach here. The priest touched the rope again, then slowly withdrew his hand. Warm. The investigator frowned. Warm water. Not rain. Spring water. A very curious detail. Very curious indeed. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Both men turned instantly. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, half hidden by steam. Motionless, watching them. For a moment nobody moved. The figure appeared female, dressed in pale robes, long dark hair falling across her shoulders. The priest inhaled sharply. The investigator immediately started forward. Stop. The figure vanished. Not ran, not turned, vanished. The steam closed around the corridor. Nothing remained. Quintus reached the spot seconds later. Empty. Entirely empty. There were no side passages, no doors, no hiding places, only stone walls and drifting vapor. The investigator stared, confused, annoyed, deeply unsettled. The priest approached slowly. His face had become pale. "Did you see her?" Quintus nodded. "Who was she?" The older man remained silent. For several seconds he simply stared into the mist. Then, "Many people have reported seeing her." The investigator turned. "You've seen her before?" The priest shook his head. "No." His voice had become very quiet. "But others have." The investigator folded his arms. "Who is she?" The answer came reluctantly. "A priestess." Quintus frowned. "What priestess?" The older man swallowed, then looked toward the spring. "The one who disappeared." Silence followed. The investigator's mind immediately sharpened. A disappearance. At last. Something tangible. Something useful. When? The priest hesitated, then answered. 20 years ago. The rain continued falling outside. The steam drifted silently through the sanctuary. And for the first time since arriving in Aquae Sulis, Quintus felt the investigation shift. The murder of Gaius Marcellus Varro was no longer an isolated event. It was connected to something older, something buried, something hidden beneath 2 decades of silence. A missing priestess, a stolen offering, a wealthy merchant, a curse, and now a ghost. The pieces were beginning to move. The problem was that Quintus still could not see the picture they formed. Far beneath the temple, unseen by anyone above, the sacred waters continued their endless journey through darkness. And somewhere within the baths, another secret waited to be uncovered. One far more dangerous than any ghost. Chapter 4. The Curse Beneath the Water. The rain finally stopped shortly before dawn. A pale mist hung over Aquae Sulis. The city remained quiet. Market traders had not yet begun their work. The roads remained empty. Only the baths were awake. The sacred spring never slept. Steam drifted across the temple complex. Lanterns glowed beneath archways. And Quintus Valerius Severus had not slept at all. The sighting of the woman in white troubled him. Not because he believed in ghosts. He did not. At least, he did not think he did. What troubled him was the reaction of the priest. Aelius Cassian had looked genuinely frightened. Not surprised. Not confused. Frightened. The distinction mattered. Experienced investigators learned to trust such things. Fear often revealed truths, words concealed. The first light of dawn filtered through the temple roofs as Quintus entered the archive chamber. Rows of scrolls filled shelves from floor to ceiling. Temple records, donations, property documents, pilgrim registers, decades of accumulated history. If a priestess had truly disappeared 20 years earlier, there would be a record. Somewhere. The archive smelled of old parchment and damp stone. Dust drifted through shafts of morning light. The investigator worked methodically, hour after hour, searching, reading, comparing. Eventually he found her, a name, written neatly upon a faded scroll. Livia Marcia, priestess of Sulis Minerva, assigned to the temple in AD 191. The records continued for several years. Routine duties, ceremonies, offerings, nothing unusual. Then abruptly, nothing. The entries simply stopped. Quintus frowned. He searched further and finally found another document. A report, short, official, deliberately vague. The sort of report written by men wishing to avoid uncomfortable questions. The final entry read, Priestess Livia Martyr presumed drowned after falling into the sacred spring during the festival of Sulis. That was all. No witnesses listed. No investigation. No explanation. Nothing. The investigator leaned back. The report felt wrong. Very wrong. A priestess drowning in the most sacred place in Aquae Sulis would have been a major event. Yet the documentation occupied less than half a page. Someone had wanted the matter forgotten. The question was why. A knock interrupted his thoughts. A temple attendant entered. Sir. What is it? The young man appeared nervous. The chief priest wishes to see you. Interesting. Very interesting. The chief priest had remained conspicuously absent from the investigation thus far. Quintus followed immediately. The chief priest occupied chambers overlooking the sacred spring. The room was spacious, comfortable, decorated with expensive furnishings, the sort of quarters enjoyed by influential men. The occupant rose as Quintus entered. Marcus Aurelianus, chief priest of Sulis Minerva, a man approaching 60, elegant, educated, respected, and immediately suspicious, not because of anything specific, simply because experience had taught Quintus that powerful men frequently appeared at the center of complicated mysteries. The priest smiled warmly. Investigator. Chief priest. The formalities concluded. The older man gestured toward a chair. Wine was offered, declined. The conversation began. I understand you've been reviewing old records. Direct. No wasted time. Quintus nodded. I have. The priest sighed. I suspected you would. The investigator waited. The older man crossed toward a window overlooking the spring. Steam drifted upward from the sacred waters below. The disappearance of Livia Marcia was a tragedy. An interesting choice of words. Disappearance, not drowning. Quintus noticed immediately. So she didn't drown. The chief priest froze, only briefly. Yet it was enough. A small mistake, the sort investigators cherish. The older man recovered quickly. I mean her death. The investigator said nothing. Silence can be remarkably effective. Eventually the priest continued. Ancient history rarely helps current investigations. There I disagree. The older man smiled faintly. I expected you might. Another silence. Then, what happened to her? The question lingered. The chief priest looked tired suddenly, older, more fragile. For a moment Quintus thought he might answer honestly. Instead he shook his head. I don't know. The investigator did not believe him. Not entirely. Not for a moment. Yet proving otherwise remained difficult. The interview achieved little else. The chief priest remained cautious, careful, measured. The sort of witness who answered questions while revealing almost nothing. When Quintus finally departed, his suspicions had only grown stronger. By afternoon, he returned to the sacred spring, the heart of the mystery, the heart of the temple, the heart of everything. Pilgrims moved through the complex once more. Visitors tossed offerings into the water. Priests conducted ceremonies. Life continued, yet beneath the surface, something felt increasingly wrong. The investigator stood beside the spring studying the dark waters. Thousands of objects rested below: coins, jewelry, offerings, curse tablets, generations of secrets. The steam drifted around him. Then he noticed something, a reflection, not within the water, beyond it, a doorway, half concealed by a marble screen. Quintus frowned. He had walked past the area several times, yet somehow he had never noticed the entrance before. Curious, very curious. He crossed the courtyard. The doorway proved locked. An iron keyhole secured an ancient wooden door. The investigator examined it carefully. Dust covered the frame, yet fresh scratches marked the lock. Recent scratches. Someone had used the door recently. A temple attendant approached. Quintus pointed. "What's in there?" The young man immediately looked uncomfortable. "Storage." "What sort of storage?" The attendant hesitated. "The old shrine." Now things became interesting. "The old shrine?" The attendant nodded reluctantly. "The original British temple?" The investigator stared. Before the Romans, before the baths, before the grand complex. There had been something else, something older. The attendant lowered his voice. "Most of it lies beneath the current buildings." Quintus looked toward the locked door. "What is inside?" The young man swallowed. "No one goes down there." The answer carried an unmistakable edge of fear. "Why not?" The attendant glanced nervously toward the spring, then answered. "Because of the curse." The investigator almost smiled. Almost. "What curse?" The attendant leaned closer. "People say Livia discovered something." The words emerged as a whisper. "Before she died." The investigator's attention sharpened immediately. "What?" The attendant shook his head. "I don't know. Nobody knows." The young man's eyes drifted toward the locked doorway. "But after she disappeared." A pause. "That door was sealed." The steam drifted between them. The sacred waters bubbled quietly. The investigator looked once more at the ancient entrance. The old shrine, the forgotten temple, the hidden chamber beneath Aquae Sulis. Instinct told him the answers lay there. The problem was obvious. Someone had spent 20 years ensuring nobody could reach them. As evening approached, Quintus stood alone beside the spring. The steam thickened. The shadows lengthened. The temple bells echoed softly through the complex. Then he heard it, a voice, faint, almost inaudible, a woman's voice, somewhere beyond the steam, speaking a single word, a name. "Livia." The investigator spun around. The courtyard stood empty. No one was there. Only drifting vapor, only sacred water, only silence. Yet for the first time since arriving in Aquae Sulis, Quintus found himself wondering whether the ghost was trying to frighten him or guide him. And somewhere beneath the baths, beyond the locked doorway and forgotten shrine, a secret buried for 20 years waited patiently in the darkness. A secret someone had already killed to protect. The voice did not return. For several moments, Quintus Valerius Severus remained motionless beside the sacred spring. Steam drifted through the courtyard. The evening bells echoed faintly across the temple complex. The water bubbled, as it always had, as it always would. Yet the investigator knew what he had heard. A single word, a single name. Livia. The missing priestess, the woman in white, the ghost, or perhaps not a ghost at all. Quintus preferred explanations that involved living people. Living people could be questioned. Ghosts rarely cooperated. The investigator looked toward the locked doorway, the old shrine, the forgotten temple, the sealed chamber beneath Aquae Sulis. Every instinct told him the mystery led there. The problem was gaining access. Fortunately, Quintus had spent 20 years investigating difficult people and difficult locks. By midnight, the baths had fallen silent once more. The final priest retired. The last attendants departed. Only a handful of temple guards remained on duty. The moon appeared briefly through broken clouds. Silver light reflected from wet stone. The city slept. Quintus did not. Wrapped in a dark cloak, he crossed the deserted courtyard carrying a lantern. The locked doorway waited exactly where he had left it. Silent, ancient, watching. The investigator produced a key. Not the correct key, simply a key. One borrowed from a military armory years earlier and retained for precisely these sorts of situations. Several minutes later, the lock clicked. The sound echoed surprisingly loudly. Quintus paused, listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Only the distant sound of running water. He opened the door. A gust of warm air emerged from below. Not stale air, not the air of a sealed chamber. Warm, fresh, recent. Someone had been using the passage. Very recently. The investigator raised his lantern and descended. The stairway spiraled beneath the baths. Stone walls glistened with moisture. The temperature increased steadily. Steam drifted through cracks in the masonry. The deeper he descended, the older everything became. Roman stonework gave way to something else. Rougher, older, British, the original temple. At last the stairs ended. Quintus stepped into a vast underground chamber. For a moment he simply stared. The room was extraordinary. Ancient stone pillars surrounded a dark pool fed directly from the sacred spring above. Primitive carvings covered the walls, symbols of the old British goddess, the original Sulis, before Rome, before Minerva, before the Empire. The investigator moved slowly through the chamber. His lantern cast dancing shadows across the stone. The atmosphere felt different here. Older, more powerful, almost untouched by time. Then he noticed something. Footprints, fresh footprints, leading across the floor. His pulse quickened. Someone had been here. Recently. Perhaps only hours ago. The trail led toward a smaller chamber beyond. Quintus followed cautiously. The footprints ended beside a stone altar, and upon the altar sat a wooden chest. The investigator frowned. The chest appeared ancient. Dust covered its sides, yet the lid stood slightly open, as though someone had recently examined its contents. He approached, raised the lantern, and looked inside. Gold. The chest was filled with gold, coins, jewelry, offerings, dozens of precious objects, and resting among them, a small golden figure, the missing statue of Sulis Minerva. For several seconds, Quintus simply stared. The stolen offering, the center of the mystery, the object around which everything revolved. After 6 months, it had finally been found. The investigator reached inside, then stopped. A sound echoed through the darkness. Footsteps, not his own. Someone else was in the shrine. Quintus extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed everything. The footsteps grew louder, slow, careful, approaching. The investigator stepped behind one of the pillars, listening, watching, waiting. A second lantern appeared around the far corner. Its glow illuminated part of the chamber. Then its owner emerged, the chief priest, Marcus Aurelianus. Quintus felt a surge of satisfaction. So, the old fox had finally revealed himself. The chief priest approached the altar, looked inside the chest, then sighed, a weary sound. Not triumphant, not greedy, sad, profoundly sad. The investigator frowned. This was not the behavior of a thief admiring stolen treasure. Something else was happening. Marcus lowered himself onto a stone bench. For several minutes, he simply sat there, staring at the chest, staring at the statue, staring at the past. Eventually, he spoke, quietly, to himself, or so he thought. "You should have left it alone." The words echoed softly through the chamber. Quintus listened carefully. The old priest shook his head. "After all these years?" Another pause. "Why couldn't you leave it buried?" The investigator's eyes narrowed. Buried. An interesting choice of word. Then another voice answered, from the darkness beyond the altar. A woman's voice, soft, calm, ancient. The investigator froze. The chief priest froze. Everyone froze, because neither man had expected a response. The voice came again, because the truth matters. Marcus slowly rose to his feet. His face had become pale, very pale. The lantern trembled in his hand. No. The voice continued. The truth always matters. A figure stepped from the darkness. White robes, dark hair. The woman from the steam. The woman from the corridors. The woman who should have been dead for 20 years. Livia Marcia, the missing priestess, the ghost of Aquae Sulis. The chief priest staggered backwards. His expression was one of pure terror. Not surprise, recognition. Quintus saw it immediately. The old man knew exactly who she was. And in that moment, the investigator realized something important. Marcus Aurelianus had not murdered Gaius Marcellus Varro, but he knew who had, and he had known for 20 years. The ghost stepped closer. The underground spring bubbled quietly beneath the chamber. The ancient shrine seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time since arriving in Aquae Sulis, Quintus realized he was no longer investigating one murder. He was investigating two. One committed yesterday, and one committed 20 years ago. The same crime, the same secret, the same hidden treasure. And before dawn arrived, someone would finally tell the truth, even if the dead had to tell it themselves. Chapter 5. The Judgment of Sulis Minerva. For several moments, nobody moved. The underground shrine remained silent except for the gentle bubbling of the sacred spring. Steam drifted across the ancient chamber. The lantern in Marcus Aurelianus's hand trembled visibly. The chief priest stared at the woman standing beyond the altar. His face had become almost colorless. "Livia." The name emerged as little more than a whisper. The figure regarded him calmly, not angrily, not accusingly, simply watching. The effect proved far more unsettling. Quintus Valerius Severus remained hidden behind the pillar. His rational mind desperately sought explanations. An accomplice, a disguise, a trick of light. Yet none felt entirely convincing. The woman looked exactly as the descriptions had described. The same robes, The same face, the same calm expression, the face of a woman dead for 20 years. Marcus slowly sank onto the stone bench. The fight seemed to leave him entirely. The years suddenly appeared upon him, all of them. You should not be here. The woman tilted her head slightly. Nor should you. Silence followed. The investigator stepped forward. There seemed little point remaining hidden now. The chief priest looked up. His expression held no surprise, only resignation. I suppose it was inevitable. Quintus folded his arms. Perhaps you would like to explain. The older man stared at the chest upon the altar, at the golden statue, at the secret he had carried for 2 decades. Eventually, he nodded. Very well. The story emerged slowly, painfully, like a wound finally opened. 20 years earlier, Livia Marcia had discovered irregularities within the temple accounts. Missing donations, missing offerings, money disappearing. At first she assumed mistakes, then negligence. Eventually she realized the truth. Someone was stealing from the goddess. Systematically, carefully, over many years. The chief priest closed his eyes. I was younger then. His voice sounded distant. I told myself it was temporary. A bitter smile appeared. Men tell themselves many things. The thefts had begun small. A few coins, a few offerings, then more still. The temple prospered. The city prospered. No one asked questions. Until Livia, the priestess, had confronted those responsible. She had threatened exposure. She had threatened scandal. She had threatened everything. Marcus looked toward the woman. I begged you to remain silent. The figure said nothing. The old priest's eyes filled with tears. You refused. Quintus listened carefully. The pieces were finally assembling. The chief priest continued. There was an argument. The chamber remained silent. We came down here. His gaze drifted toward the spring. The old shrine. The place where it had all begun. The place where it would now end. Marcus lowered his head. She fell. The investigator said nothing. The old man looked broken, completely broken. At least, he swallowed. That is what I told myself. The words echoed softly, a confession without quite becoming one. The priest closed his eyes. We argued. Another pause. I grabbed her arm. The silence deepened. She lost her footing. Steam drifted between them. The spring bubbled quietly. Marcus's voice became almost inaudible. She struck her head. The old man stared into the darkness. I tried to help. The words sounded genuine, tragically genuine, yet insufficient, far too insufficient. The woman continued watching him, neither forgiving nor condemning, simply present. The chief priest exhaled slowly. I panicked. The investigator already knew the rest. The cover-up, the false report, the sealed shrine, 20 years of silence, 20 years of guilt, 20 years of lies. Yet one question remained, the most recent murder. The merchant. Marcus looked up. For a moment confusion crossed his face, then understanding. Gaius Marcellus. Quintus nodded. The chief priest laughed softly. The sound held no humor. He discovered everything. The investigator frowned. The theft? Not the theft. Marcus looked toward the chest. The cover-up. The old merchant had become obsessed with the missing statue. His search eventually led him to old records, old rumors, old inconsistencies. Eventually, he had discovered the sealed shrine, and with it, the truth. The missing offering had never been stolen. It had been hidden. Along with evidence of the priestess's death, the merchant had confronted someone, the wrong someone. A silence settled over the chamber. Then Quintus asked the obvious question. Who? The answer came from behind them. A voice, young, terrified. I did. Everyone turned. A figure stood at the entrance to the shrine. A temple attendant. Lucius, the young man who had discovered the body. The young man nobody had suspected. The young man who had seemed frightened from the very beginning, because he had been, terrified. The attendant stepped forward slowly. Tears streamed down his face. He found out. His voice shook. He found everything. The chamber listened. The young man looked utterly defeated. My grandfather served here. Another piece slid into place. He told me the story. Lucius looked toward the ghostly figure. He told me what happened to her. The attendant's hands trembled. He said the temple must never be disgraced. The words sounded pathetic now, small, meaningless. Yet once they had justified murder. The young man looked toward Quintus. I only wanted to frighten him. The investigator had heard similar sentences many times. They rarely ended well. The curse tablets. Lucius nodded. I wrote them. The mystery of the tablets finally solved. He wouldn't stop investigating. The attendant's voice cracked. He kept asking questions. He kept getting closer. Closer to the truth. Closer to scandal. Closer to the hidden shrine. The young man lowered his head. We argued beside the great bath. The chamber remained silent. He slipped. The same words, the same excuse. 20 years apart. The same tragedy. The same mistake. Or perhaps not a mistake. The distinction hardly mattered anymore. The attendant collapsed onto his knees, sobbing, the weight of guilt finally crushing him. For several moments nobody spoke. The spring bubbled softly. The steam drifted through the ancient shrine. Then Quintus looked toward the woman, toward Livia Marcia, toward the ghost, or whatever she truly was. The figure smiled, a sad smile, a peaceful smile. Then she turned toward the waters. The steam thickened around her. The lantern light faded, and slowly, gently, she disappeared. Not dramatically, not frighteningly, simply gone, like mist beneath sunlight. The chamber fell silent once more. The chief priest stared at the place where she had stood. Tears ran freely down his face. At last he whispered, I'm sorry. The words came 20 years too late, yet somehow they still mattered. Above them, dawn began to brighten the city. The first rays of sunlight touched Aquae Sulis. The rain had ended. The storm had passed. The truth had finally emerged. Later that morning, Lucius was taken into custody. Marcus Aurelianus resigned his office. The hidden shrine was reopened, the golden statue restored to the temple. And for the first time in 2 decades, the name of Livia Marcia was spoken openly once more. No longer forgotten, no longer hidden, no longer buried beneath silence. Weeks later, as Quintus prepared to leave Aquae Sulis, he paused beside the sacred spring one final time. Steam rose into the morning air. Pilgrims cast offerings into the waters. Priests conducted ceremonies. Life continued, as it always had. The investigator looked into the depths. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a reflection. A woman standing beside the water, watching, smiling. Then the image vanished. Perhaps it had never been there at all. Quintus smiled faintly. For once, he did not investigate further. Some mysteries, he decided, belonged to the gods. And beneath the warm waters of Sulis Minerva, the past finally found peace. The end.